The email came at 2:14 a.m., and the moment I saw the subject line, "Immediate termination, effective today," my stomach dropped. Not because I feared losing my job. No. I'd built half the company's infrastructure, saved them from 4 data breaches, and secured patents worth more than their entire payroll. I wasn't worried about my future. I was furious because this wasn't an accident. The CEO's son, freshly promoted, painfully incompetent, and drunk on nepotism, had fired me 48 hours before my $92,000 performance bonus vested. And everyone knew why. He wanted that budget for his innovation department, which was just a room full of beanbags and people who spent more time on TikTok than GitHub. I sat in my dark kitchen staring at the glowing screen, replaying everything over the last year, the nights I'd slept under my desk, the weekends I'd canceled plans, the systems I'd built that this company literally could not function without. And somehow, that little prince had decided I was unreliable. A threat. Replaceable. He'd actually written that in the termination letter, as if I were some outdated software. I didn't rage. I didn't cry. I didn't even get up from my chair. I just leaned back, cracked my knuckles, and whispered, "All right. Let's see how well you run without me." The truth was something the CEO's son had no idea about. When I was hired 9 years earlier, the company didn't own a single line of what became its core technology. I did. The patents, the frameworks, the automation scripts, the security backbone, everything that made the company valuable was under my name, licensed to them under a renewable contract. They paid for usage, not ownership. And the next renewal was due in, ironically, 3 days. When they fired me, they terminated their own license agreement. Which meant that in 72 hours, everything they depended on would legally shut down. I didn't need revenge. They'd already chosen it. I just needed to step back and let the avalanche fall. 3 days later, right on schedule, the company's servers flickered. The automation pipeline froze mid-cycle. Client data stopped syncing. Their biggest financial partner got locked out of the dashboard. Then the CEO called a critical emergency meeting, which leaked almost instantly to the whole staff. "We're experiencing a system-wide license conflict." License conflict. That was cute. It meant the guy we fired owns everything, and we can't use it anymore. By noon, their 3 largest clients threatened to pull contracts. By 3 p.m., the CEO's son publicly blamed legacy architecture issues, which was funny because I was the legacy architecture. And by 6 p.m., the board had voted to remove him from any technical decision-making. I thought that would be the end of it, humiliation, collapse, and quiet bankruptcy, but the real destruction came from somewhere I didn't expect, the investors. Turns out, they'd invested heavily because of my patents. Without them, the company wasn't worth the paper their valuation was printed on. Within a week, stocks tanked. Within 2, the board announced restructuring. And by the end of the month, the headlines were everywhere. Tech company collapses after losing rights to $320 million proprietary system. People messaged me constantly, former coworkers, industry friends, even reporters. But I didn't speak. Not once. I didn't have to. Everyone knew. And the CEO's son? He tried to get a job at a smaller firm, but word traveled fast. Nobody hires the guy who fires the architect that built the company. One morning, months later, I ran into a former colleague at a cafe. He looked exhausted but relieved. "You destroyed them," he said. "Clean. Surgical. Like justice." I stirred my coffee, shrugged, and answered honestly, "I didn't destroy anything. They fired the wrong person." And that's the truth of corporate revenge. Sometimes you don't need to sabotage anything. Sometimes people build the guillotine themselves, and all you have to do is step aside and let gravity finish the job. They fired me 48 hours before my bonus. I walked away owning everything they needed to survive. And in the end, the company didn't just lose $92,000. They lost $320 million. The CEO's son fired me on a Wednesday, 48 hours before my $92,000 bonus vested, and he did it with the smuggest grin I'd ever seen. He leaned back in his leather chair, spinning a golden pen between his fingers like he'd earned it, and said, "Nothing personal. Just business." I stood there holding the termination papers he'd printed before I even walked in, knowing damn well this wasn't about efficiency or restructuring. It was about ego. He wanted to make an example out of the guy his father praised too often. The guy whose ideas everyone respected more than his. He thought firing me would show he was finally in charge. What he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have known, is that for the past 9 years, the entire company had been running on technology that I still own the core rights to. Not the company. Not the CEO. Not the board. Me. Because they never bothered reading the grandfathered IP contract I signed before they bought out my former startup. They assumed it was all theirs. It wasn't. And by the time their lawyers figured that out, it was already far too late. I walked out of that office with my box of belongings, but I wasn't defeated. I was calculating. Furious, yes, but controlled. The kind of control that made you dangerous. The son thought he'd handled me before payroll hit. What he actually did was unleash a silent clock that had been waiting almost a decade to strike. Because the moment my employment was terminated, certain clauses in my contract automatically activated. Clauses that granted me the ability to revoke licensing rights if I was terminated without cause. And since they fired me without explanation, no misconduct, no violation, no performance review, they had practically gift-wrapped that clause for me. I didn't march back inside screaming. I didn't send threats. I simply went home, brewed a cup of coffee, opened my laptop, and prepared the withdrawal notice. Calmly. Precisely. Legally. I submitted the revocation to the Federal IP Registry at 11:42 p.m. At 11:57, I emailed the CEO, the board, and yes, his idiot son, and told them that their main operational software suite would lose all operating rights in 72 hours. A $320 million platform. Their supply chain backbone. Their customer fulfillment engine. Their compliance system. All of it. Every line of code tied to my original framework. They didn't own it. They had only been renting it. And now the lease was up. The panic began by sunrise. I watched the board members try calling me 23 times before noon. The CEO sent long, desperate emails. The son sent one message: "This is illegal. You can't do this." I didn't respond. Instead, I forwarded them the signed, notarized IP agreement their legal department had ignored for years. Then I forwarded their own HR paperwork firing me without cause. And at the bottom of that email, I wrote, "Nothing personal. Just business." The son went silent. The board did not. They begged me to return, to renegotiate, to work something out for the good of the company. But I had no intention of saving people who believed loyalty was something to be exploited until payday. So the countdown reached 0. At 3 p.m. on the dot, automated scripts I'd installed years ago in the original architecture activated. No viruses. No sabotage. Nothing illegal. Just a clean and perfectly lawful revocation of proprietary functionality. Systems froze. Production lines stalled. Fulfillment centers went offline. Vendors withdrew. Customers panicked. Stock price plummeted 61% in 8 hours. By the end of the week, the CEO's son was transitioned out. By the end of the month, the CEO stepped down for personal reasons. By the end of the quarter, the company had filed for structured bankruptcy, citing unforeseen technical complications as the primary cause. The media speculated for weeks. No one outside the boardroom ever knew the truth. The company that fired me to save $92,000 lost $320 million instead. I took a position as CTO at a rival firm, one that respected contracts and the people who built their empires. They let me expand my technology the way it was always meant to grow. And sometimes, when I'm feeling nostalgic, I think back to the moment that kid smirked at me from across that desk. He believed he was ending my future. But really, he was only ending his entire company. Some revenge is loud, dramatic, explosive. Mine didn't need to be. Mine was written in legal ink 9 years before he fired me. Mine waited patiently until the right moment. And when that moment came, it was simple. It was quiet. It was devastating. Nothing personal. Just business. He fired me on a Wednesday. 48 hours before my $92,000 performance bonus was scheduled to hit my account. And he did it with that smug, crooked half-smile he'd inherited from his father, like stepping on people was his birthright. I still remember the words he used. We're moving in a younger, more dynamic direction. Your role is redundant. Redundant. After 9 years building the tech that held the entire company together, the CEO's son, who couldn't debug a calculator app, looked me in the eye and called me redundant. I didn't argue. I didn't shout. I didn't even ask why. Because in that moment, as he slid the termination papers across the desk, I realized something he didn't know. Something no one in that building knew. The technology he thought he owned, the infrastructure, the architecture, the code base, the automation engines, the security wrappers, every single piece of innovation I had poured into that company, didn't legally belong to them. It belonged to me. I had created it 2 years before I ever joined. Licensed it exclusively to the company under a clause only one person besides me ever read, a clause that automatically revoked usage rights upon unethical termination. And unethical termination was defined very, very clearly. Let's just say, firing an employee to avoid paying their earned compensation. That qualified. I walked out of the building quietly, box in hand, badge turned in, back straight. People looked at me with pity. The CEO's son strutted around like he'd executed some brilliant corporate maneuver. The CFO even clapped him on the shoulder. But by the time I reached the parking lot, I'd already opened my laptop and initiated the revocation sequence. Not to delete anything, no, that would be illegal. But to withdraw every proprietary license, every authentication token, every back-end access key that allowed them to legally operate on my software. They didn't notice right away. But the next morning, oh, they noticed. The email hit my inbox at 2:14 a.m., the kind of hour when only 3 types of people are awake: thieves, the heartbroken, and idiots. Turns out the CEO's son was the third. He didn't even have the spine to fire me during the day. Instead, he sent a cold, 2-sentence termination message claiming department restructuring, effectively cutting me off 48 hours before my $92,000 performance bonus was set to vest. No call. No meeting. Just a digital knife in the back. I stared at the screen, heart pounding, not because I was afraid, but because of the one thing he didn't know. For 8 years, I had quietly owned the intellectual property rights to the core architecture their entire $320 million tech division operated on. Not licensed. Not rented. Owned. A signature the original CEO insisted on just in case. And his son had no idea that just in case was about to become too late. The next morning, I walked into the office like nothing had happened. People nodded as I passed, unaware that I was already legally severed from the company. But the moment I stepped into the elevator, my anger transformed into something far more dangerous: calm. I remembered every night I'd worked late to keep their systems from collapsing, every holiday I'd sacrificed to finish code his son proudly slapped his name on, every emergency call where I was the one dragging the organization back from the brink while he was nursing cocktails in Dubai. I reached my desk, logged in with my still active credentials, and watched the dashboard load like it always had. And then I clicked the button I had never thought I'd need, the one that activated the separation clause built into my IP license. The effect was instant but subtle at first. Internal services flagged warnings. Data pipeline stalled. The system tried to restart itself, but each reboot only triggered deeper dependency checks, all roads leading back to components legally tied to my ownership. By noon, the CTO was storming through the hallway. By 2 p.m., the CEO's son was red-faced in a conference room screaming at engineers who couldn't fix what they didn't own. I wasn't obligated to explain anything, but when he finally called me from an unknown number, voice trembling under forced bravado, I answered with a calmness that made him stumble. "You fired me," I said simply. "And my license terminated with my employment. The system is doing exactly what it's supposed to do." I heard him realize it, the slow, sinking horror of a man about to understand the price of his own stupidity. By evening, the board was demanding answers. Overnight, customers began reporting outages. Regulatory agencies flagged compliance failures. Multi-million-dollar contracts froze. And I was at home eating takeout, watching it unfold like a slow-motion corporate train wreck. I didn't have to sabotage anything. They had done it themselves by pushing out the only person who understood the machine they were bragging about to investors. The next morning, headlines hit the tech world: $320M platform paralyzed by licensing crisis. Executive team scrambles to recover core IP. CEO's son linked to catastrophic oversight. My phone lit up with messages from former coworkers, all whispering the same sentiment: they finally messed with the wrong guy. The breach of operations triggered automatic contract penalties that cost the company tens of millions within hours. Class action lawsuits started forming. Investors demanded emergency meetings. The CEO's son tried to blame everyone: engineering, procurement, even the customers, until the board silenced him. They brought in independent auditors who traced the licensing chain back to me, all signed legally, all documented meticulously. When they reached out to negotiate reinstating the license, they learned what I'd already known would happen: a competitor had offered me double my old salary and full creative control to rebuild the architecture from scratch, without the toxicity, without the incompetence, without the inheritance baby-playing executive. By the end of the week, the CEO's son was removed from all operational authority. By the end of the month, he resigned to pursue personal opportunities, which was corporate code for run before the lawsuits hit. And the company he'd been so proud to rule? It never recovered. The outage lasted 19 days. The fine surpassed $160 million. The contracts lost pushed the total financial damage past $320 million. Their stock plunged so far it never returned to previous levels. Meanwhile, I signed my new contract, walked into a clean office with people who actually respected intelligence over nepotism, and felt something I hadn't felt in years: freedom. Not petty revenge. Not anger. Just freedom. Because firing me to save $92,000 cost them $320 million. And all it took was leaving their system to run exactly the way they agreed it would. He didn't even look at me when he fired me. That's what stuck with me the most. 48 hours before my $92,000 performance bonus was set to clear, the CEO's son stood there with his cheap cologne, his fake confidence, and his printed termination letter, acting like he was doing me a favor. "We're restructuring," he said, eyes glued to his phone. Your position is no longer aligned with the company's forward vision. My forward vision, ironically, had built half the tech that kept their company alive for the last decade. But you don't argue with a man who thinks inheritance is intelligence. I walked out with a box of things worth nothing, and a mind full of things worth $320 million. And in that moment, as the automatic doors closed behind me, I realized he had just made the single most catastrophic corporate mistake of his life. Because the one thing he forgot when he fired me was the one thing that was going to destroy them. I own the intellectual rights to every core system his father thought the company owned. They didn't know that yet. But they would. The next morning, I woke up before dawn, not because I had to, but because my mind was on fire. That's what happens when someone underestimates you so badly, they accidentally hand you the match to burn down their own empire. I made coffee, sat at my kitchen counter, and reread the documents I had drafted long before any of this happened. They were clean, airtight, and devastating. A perfect blueprint for the kind of justice only patience can buy. When the world calls you obsolete, replaceable, not a team fit, it forgets one crucial detail: people like me don't vanish. We watch. We build. And when the time is right, we strike where it hurts most, the truth. Within hours, I was on a video call with the acquisition firm that had once begged to license my technology, the same technology the CEO's son arrogantly dismissed as old, slow, and overpriced. Their director nearly choked when he saw me appear on screen. "You're the original architect?" he asked, stunned. I nodded. "And the rightful owner," I added, sliding the digital contracts into the shared folder. The moment they realized they could legally obtain my tech directly without going through the company that fired me, their interest skyrocketed. Deals like this take companies months to negotiate. Mine took a day, because desperation accelerates everything. By the time the sun went down, I had signed a multi-year licensing partnership worth enough to make losing that $92,000 bonus feel like pocket change. But more importantly, I had set something in motion, something irreversible. My former employer didn't know it yet, but the foundation under their feet had just cracked. And the person who swung the hammer was the man they escorted out with a cardboard box. The next 48 hours were a blur of calls, documents, and strategy sessions. The acquisition firm moved fast, faster than anyone expected, because once they confirmed ownership, they immediately began the process to migrate all their enterprise clients onto my platform. And here's where the real poetic justice began. My ex-company had built half its revenue on servicing those exact same enterprise clients. They thought my tech was outdated. But when the market moved, when demand changed, suddenly I wasn't outdated. They were unprepared. And incompetence has a way of aging companies faster than any technology ever could. On the third morning, I woke to a headline that made me spill my coffee: CSN Tech suffers crippling service outages, clients flee TO competitor system. I didn't even need to read the full article to know what had happened. Their system couldn't handle the new load. Couldn't scale. Couldn't secure transactions the way mine did. They had let a nepotism hire run the engineering department into the ground, and their arrogance had blinded them to reality. They fired the wrong person and kept the wrong leader. The stock dipped 12% by noon. 20% by end of day. People were panicking online. Anonymous employees leaked screenshots. Customers started posting videos explaining why they were jumping ship. But the moment everything snapped was the emergency press conference. The CEO himself appeared, pale, sweaty, exhausted, stumbling through a statement about unexpected infrastructure challenges. Then he froze mid-sentence, eyes wide, as a reporter asked the question that ended everything: "Is it true the technology you replaced was actually owned by your former senior engineer, the one your son fired?" His silence was the longest 10 seconds of his life. And the most satisfying of mine. Then came the inevitable: investigations, investor walkouts, lawsuits, 40-year pillars collapsing under the weight of one man's ego and one son's incompetence. And I didn't break a sweat. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't even step into the building. I simply took back what was mine, and the rest fell like dominoes. The CEO's son strutted into the conference room like he owned gravity itself, tossing my termination letter onto the table as if it were a parking ticket. 48 hours. 48 hours before my $92,000 performance bonus hit, after 12 years of building the company's entire predictive systems architecture. "We're moving in a more modern direction," he said, leaning back in the chair his father once respected. "Your old-school approach doesn't fit our vision." Old school. That was the word he chose. The same code he called outdated had saved the company from 3 market crashes and 2 international compliance storms. But none of that mattered to a spoiled heir who thought leadership was inherited like eye color. I didn't argue. I didn't even blink. Because he had no idea, absolutely zero idea, that the very technology he dismissed, I legally own 100%. And firing me triggered the clause that would become their downfall. I packed my desk quietly, ignoring the not-so-subtle smirks from his little circle of innovation brothers. They thought they'd finally pushed out the one man who kept warning them about cutting corners and rewriting my systems without understanding how they worked. They joked that they'd rebuild everything in a month. I didn't bother reminding them that what they called everything was 14 years of proprietary architecture. What they didn't know, and what their father somehow forgot to tell them, was that my ownership agreement with the original board had a special provision: if I left the company for any reason other than voluntary retirement, all licensing rights to my tech expired instantly. And without that license, they weren't just vulnerable. They were illegally operating on stolen technology. 2 days after my firing, their entire infrastructure began to sag under its own weight. The data models started degrading. Predictive outputs fell to 0.3% accuracy. Risk assessments began contradicting themselves. The system wasn't broken, it had simply entered protection mode, something I designed years ago to prevent tampering and theft. Internally, they panicked. Externally, the market noticed. Their investors demanded answers, but the CEO's son insisted nothing was wrong. Meanwhile, I sat at home drinking coffee, reading the headlines about mysterious system failures and unexpected volatility. My phone buzzed with messages from old colleagues, scared, confused, begging for clarity, but I stayed silent. Retaliation wasn't necessary. The contract would handle everything. On the 7th day, they finally realized the truth. A desperate email arrived from their legal team, asking, no, pleading, for a meeting. They wanted to renegotiate. They wanted to restore cooperation. They wanted me to fix the mess. I agreed to meet, but only in writing and only through federal arbitration channels. When they saw the notice, their confidence evaporated. Because the moment they fired me, the moment that letter hit the conference table, they had nullified $320 million worth of tech infrastructure, tech they relied on to survive regulatory audits, market modeling, and client compliance verification. And now they were operating illegally, in violation of multiple federal statutes. When the arbitration hearing began, the CEO's son walked in pale, sweating, suddenly very aware that leadership wasn't something you inherited, it was something you earned. Their lawyers argued that the firing was a miscommunication. My attorney calmly projected the original licensing clause on a screen: termination by employer results in immediate revocation of licensed intellectual property. The arbitrator didn't even need a recess. He ruled in my favor on the spot. The company had 48 hours to cease using all systems built on my architecture, notify all clients of the shutdown, and pay damages for unauthorized use. And just like that, the company collapsed. Stock price, gone. Investors, fled. Market reputation, annihilated. The CEO resigned. The son, my former executioner, was escorted out of the building by security, the same way he had once smirked watching them escort me. And the irony? My bonus, my $92,000 bonus, was eventually paid as part of the damages. I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. I simply returned to what I did best, building. Within months, I was leading a new tech foundation, training young engineers, teaching them what real innovation looked like, not entitlement, not inherited authority, but craftsmanship. The industry whispered my name like a cautionary tale. Don't fire the man who built your empire unless you understand what's holding it up. Because they thought firing me would save them $92,000. Instead, it cost them $320 million. And history will always remember which one of us truly understood value. The silence that followed that meeting was electric, the kind that vibrates right under your skin, like the moment before a thunderstorm cracks open the sky. The CEO's son, Brandon, stood there in the middle of the conference room blinking at the empty seats where the board had just been sitting, their expressions pale and stunned as they filed out. He looked like a kid who had pulled the wrong wire out of a machine and only realized after it started smoking. And there I was, leaning against the doorway with nothing but a folder under my arm, watching him try to process the fact that the empire he thought he inherited was now collapsing under its own arrogance. I didn't say a word. I didn't have to. The servers were offline, the codebase frozen, and all proprietary tech linked to my license, locked. Legally, ethically, indisputably. The beautiful part? I'd warned him. Not once. Not twice. But in 3 separate emails that he never bothered to read. He was too busy bragging about how he was dragging this dinosaur company into the future while I was the one who had built the software that created their future. He finally snapped out of it and shouted my name like he expected me to run back into the room and obey. Ethan! Ethan! You can't do this. You can't just take everything. I raised my eyebrows. Brandon, I didn't take anything. I just stopped giving you free access to something you never owned. His face went red, not the embarrassed kind, but the entitled kind. The kind that comes from someone who's never been told no in his life. My father owns this company. That makes this tech ours. I almost pitted him. Almost. Your father fired me, I said calmly. 48 hours before my bonus. And you signed the termination papers. Remember? I believe you called it a necessary purge of outdated thinking. He swallowed hard. That phrase had aged poorly. Let me simplify it for you, I continued. I created the system. I own the IP. I licensed it to the company on a renewable contract that expires the moment I'm no longer an employee. You fired me. Contract expired. Access revoked. He stared at me like he was finally realizing gravity existed. And then, just to make the moment cinematic, the emergency alerts started popping up on the room's digital screens. System failures. Revenue operations halted. Payment platforms disconnected. Clients already asking why they couldn't access critical features. 90% of the company's revenue hinged on my technology. 90. He backed into a chair and sank down like the air had been punched out of him. I stepped forward, placed the folder gently on the table, and said, "This is a list of the warnings I gave. This is a copy of the licensing structure your legal team approved. And this," I tapped the last page, "is a list of the companies I'll be meeting with next week. Ones who value innovation more than nepotism." He didn't look up. I doubt he could. As I turned to leave, he muttered something. "You'll ruin us." I paused. "No, "Brandon," I said softly. "You did that when you mistook a bonus for betrayal and a crown for competence." Then I walked out. Calm, steady, and free, carrying with me the $320 million worth of tech they never deserved and never respected. By the time the dust finally settled, the story of their downfall had already spread far beyond anything I could have orchestrated. Investors called it the most preventable implosion in tech history. Analysts called it a masterclass in corporate negligence. But the employees, the ones who had suffered the arrogance, the favoritism, the incompetence, they called it something else entirely: justice. I watched from a distance as the board tried to stitch together public statements, excuses, explanations. None of them stuck. Not when the patents transferred ownership. Not when the servers went dark. Not when every major client pulled out within 72 hours. You don't fire the architect of your empire and hand the keys to someone who only knows how to take selfies in the executive parking lot. But they did exactly that. And the world watched the consequences unfold with morbid fascination. The CEO's son made one last desperate attempt to shift the blame, claiming I'd sabotaged the company out of spite. But when federal auditors pulled the records and discovered the legally binding agreements with my signature, agreements I'd drafted years before to protect myself against exactly this kind of stupidity, the narrative flipped overnight. It wasn't sabotage. It was ownership. It was structure. It was the very architecture of the system they had taken for granted. When the company officially filed for bankruptcy, I was sitting on the balcony of my new place overlooking the coast, coffee in hand, watching the sun rise. The phone buzzed non-stop: reporters, former colleagues, ex-clients begging for consultations, venture funds offering partnerships. I ignored most of it. Not out of arrogance, but because the moment didn't need noise. It needed silence. Silence to appreciate how far I'd come since the night I boxed up my desk, robbed of a bonus but full of quiet resolve. In the end, I didn't win because I destroyed them. I won because I built something they never understood: leverage. Years of innovation they never valued. Systems they never respected. Intellectual property they assumed they controlled. They fired me thinking they were cutting dead weight. They didn't realize they were throwing away the foundation stone holding their entire empire upright. And as for that $92,000 bonus, I earned something far more satisfying. I earned freedom, wealth, recognition, and the undeniable truth that I didn't need their validation, because the market validated me louder than they ever could. Sometimes revenge is loud, explosive, dramatic. But sometimes, it's just letting people face the consequences of disrespecting the wrong person. They fired me 48 hours before my bonus. 48 hours later, I owned everything they thought belonged to them. And the rest is history.